Mark 1 Overwriting the Mess. The low-profile podcast microphones caught a sharp click as the audio engineer balanced the input levels for the 5 panelists, the digital indicators glowing red against the soundproof studio walls to signal they were officially live. Elena adjusted her master outline, locking eyes with the panel to anchor the conversation directly to the fast-paced velocity of the second gospel. Welcome back to the Crossroads podcast, where today we are stripping away standard commentary to put a spotlight on the hidden structural markers people read right past in the opening movement of the second gospel, Elena said, leaning toward her console. We are bypassing basic summaries to cross-examine 3 precise elements: the historical dispute of the intertestamental timeline, the concentrated imagery of the number 40, and a massive, medical subversion of ancient purity laws. Pastor Nathan, your tradition conventionalizes a clean 4th-century prophetic pause between Malachi and the wilderness appearance of John, but the history on the ground suggests a far more turbulent setting. Pastor Nathan tapped his thumb against his open journal, jumping straight into the historical friction. For our community, that span highlights a deliberate prophetic pause to emphasize the sheer shock value of John's sudden announcement breaking a historic silence. But as a panel, we have to look at the continuous historical trauma that was actually boiling over. Father Thomas, your canon doesn't even recognize a historical vacuum during those 400 years, does it? Father Thomas shook his head, shifting his notes to highlight the alternative tracking. Not at all, because the Catholic perspective integrates the deuterocanonical books directly into the text, showing that historical reporting and divine intervention continued straight through the Maccabean crisis. John's appearance in chapter 1 isn't breaking an unexpected quiet. It is a direct answer to the recent defilement of the temple by Antiochus Epiphanes, and a profound national longing for a true Davidic king. Rabbi Jonathan adjusted his spectacles, expanding the timeline away from a simple vacuum. And the Dead Sea Scrolls back that up completely, proving that sectarian Jewish groups like the Qumran Essenes never believed God was silent. They believed the Holy Spirit was actively dispensing inspired prophetic interpretations in their own lifetime, which is precisely why they established a wilderness community. They went out into the exact desert terrain mentioned in Mark chapter 1 because they believed they were physically executing Isaiah's preparation mandate in real time. Ethan filtered the timeline through his logistics background, visualizing the operational reality for an everyday observer. So for an ordinary person watching John out there, this wasn't an isolated magic trick. It was a highly organized, long-standing spiritual and political movement that had been simmering for generations. Rabbi Jonathan nodded directly at him. Exactly, Ethan. It was a volatile pressure cooker, not a vacuum. Elena steered the pacing back to the text, gesturing to the theological block. Let's move directly into that wilderness geography, she said. Immediately after the baptism, the text notes that Jesus is driven by the Spirit into the desert for 40 days, surrounded by wild animals and ministered to by angels. Chloe, when an everyday reader encounters that number 40, what is the psychological reaction? Chloe leaned toward her microphone, shrugging slightly. Honestly, most people just view it as a generic Sunday school symbol for a really long time of waiting, like Noah's flood, she said. Pastor Nathan countered immediately, his pen tapping the desk to emphasize the structural layout. But the narrative design is far more deliberate than a generic timeline. It is a highly concentrated microcosm of Israel's history. Where Adam faced his testing in a perfected, lush garden surrounded by cooperative creation and failed, Jesus enters a brutal, depleted wasteland among wild beasts to systematically reverse the original human collapse. Where the corporate nation of Israel spent 40 years grumbling and failing their probation in the desert, Jesus endures 40 days of intense satanic opposition without compromise to succeed where the nation faltered. Father Thomas overlapped the point, tracing the prophetic pedigree, and it links him directly to the ultimate prophetic reformers. Moses endured a 40-day fast on Mount Sinai during the mediation of the legal covenant, and Elijah journeyed 40 days and 40 nights to Mount Horeb, sustained entirely by a single supernatural meal. By replicating that exact 40-day baseline before launching his public ministry, Jesus is physically presenting himself as both the definitive lawgiver and the ultimate prophet. Ethan tracked the mechanical symmetry of the parallels on his pad. So the author uses 3 short verses to condense centuries of covenant history into a single event. He's setting up an intentional structural pedigree before the public ministry even starts. Elena checked the countdown timer on her console, nodding as the focus shifted to the legal climax. Precisely, she said, but that structural pedigree leads directly to a massive medical and legal shock at the end of chapter 1. A man covered in leprosy approaches Jesus, begging to be made clean. Rabbi Jonathan, walk our listeners through the absolute legal mechanics of contagious defilement under the Levitical framework. Rabbi Jonathan opened his hands, explaining the volatile transmission laws. The blueprint is incredibly strict, As laid out in Haggai 2 and Ezekiel 44, Haggai explicitly quizzes the priests on the laws of transmission, establishing that if you carry consecrated meat in your garment fold, that garment cannot transmit holiness to common food. However, if a ritually defiled person touches anything, the defilement spreads instantly. Under the Old Covenant, impurity behaves as a volatile, dominant contagion, while holiness is restricted, insulated, and localized to prevent unauthorized consecration of the populace. According to Leviticus 13 and 14, anyone who touches a leper becomes automatically unclean. The impurity always wins. Chloe grimaced slightly, sketching a small icon on her notepad. "It's the classic drop of ink in a glass of milk," she said. "The ink ruins the purity of the milk every single time." Father Thomas raised his voice slightly, cutting through the heavy biological reality of the law, which is exactly what makes the tactical breach in Mark chapter 1 so revolutionary. Under the Levitical code, Jesus was legally required to back away to preserve his ritual boundaries. Instead, he fills with compassion, extends his hand, and deliberately initiates physical contact with the unclean individual. Pastor Nathan caught his eye, finishing the thought with high energy. And look at the directional flow of the transmission. The moment contact is made, the contagion flows in reverse. The contagious disease does not infect or compromise Jesus' status. Instead, his sovereign act of holiness expands into the leper, neutralizing the defilement and instantly purifying the flesh from the inside out. It completely upends the traditional mechanics of ritual transmission. Holiness becomes the dominant infectious force. Ethan leaned back, reviewing the entire system loop. So instead of protecting his purity through strict separation from the mess, he uses his purity as an active force to overwrite the mess entirely? Pastor Nathan pointed directly at him. Exactly, Ethan. It is an absolute inversion of the entire ancient system. Elena adjusted her headphones as the audio engineer began fading the background theme music back into the mix. We have laid out the arguments, a continuous historical timeline versus a prophetic silence, a concentrated 40-day pattern of corporate history, and a radical reversal of ancient purity laws, she said, signing off into her primary camera. To our audience out there, the text is right in front of you. You get to decide.